Whoever is listed as Wayno, if you would change your name to reflect your school.
That's Eric from my team. He's fighting with a wet carpet at home, but he's online.
Okay, so that's a Fond du Lac student. Cody, could you please announce your school as well? At the bottom of the screen, you'll also see an icon that says chat. You might want to open the chat. I'm not going to say that I'm going to monitor it. Kelly, could you keep your eye on the chat?
Sure.
But I'm going to put one thing into the chat right now. And that's a link to a location where we've posted some stuff. So let's get started. Hello, welcome. This is James Flaten with the Minnesota Space Grant. I'm at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And this is what we're calling lesson 1 of our remote high-power rocketry online lessons. Lesson 0 was when we got together, some of us at least, and handed out stuff. So to be honest, we're going to go over some of the same things again this evening. It will be very fast. All of these lessons will be very fast. 1 hour is not adequate time to talk about everything we would like to talk about, but it's enough time to give you an idea of where you could learn more, including reading the books, including looking at things that have been posted by us. So just by way of introduction, I'll just say a couple of words about myself and then let TA Kelly Behlen introduce herself. I work at the University of Minnesota. I do high-power rocketry and other things to try and promote interest in STEM in general and NASA sort of more particularly. And so rocketry is one of those things. And I'm really glad you're here. I've been doing this for about 10 years or so. I think this is the 4th time I've tried teaching it to people remotely. The plan with the remote lessons is to have a series of lessons during which you will build a specific rocket. You all have it already, and it will be the same rocket for all the teams. There will be some optional parts which you can be a little creative with, or you can skip them if you want to. And then by the end of October, the rocket will be finished and we will fly the rockets, weather permitting, all together. So that's enough of an introduction for me. Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, what are you wanting me to add to that?
I want you to introduce yourself only because there are some people online who were not with us on Saturday.
Gotcha. So my name is Kelly Behlen. I'm an Inver Hills Community College student, possibly overly engaged in different programs here. I work with Dr. Flaten through the Minnesota Space Grant with the high-powered rocketry and helping to put together a team at our school for the high-altitude ballooning. I have been in this program that you're in right now. I was in this a couple years ago and have competed in the competition the last 2 years. And now I'm going to be doing the TA to help you guys to build your rockets.
Okay, thanks. That reminds me, I was going to announce that competition. We are not doing a competition this fall, but this training would put you in a position, if you were interested in, to participate in additional rocketry, possibly, but not necessarily including competition rocketry. Kelly, make a note to remind me at the very end of the thing to say something about the competition, this year's competition, and to post the competition information in the website. It's not there yet because I forgot to put it there.
Okay.
The teams that have signed up to participate here, I just want to run around the list here and make sure we have representatives from all the teams. Hopefully we do. Augsburg, just say aye.
I can tell you we have Century, Augsburg, Fond du Lac, Normandale, St. John's, and St. Thomas. A couple new people have come in and they did not amend their names with their schools, so I'm not sure if we have anybody else here.
Okay, so Calvin, can you please put the name of your school next to your name so we know what school you're from? Thank you.
Yep.
Do that by opening up the participant tab at the bottom to get a list of names, find your name, actually right-click on your photo or right-click on your space on the screen and you can rename yourself, Calvin. One moment.
Soraya, would you be able to go ahead and right-click your picture and change your name to reflect your school, please?
Oh, yes.
So here's actually a question, and that is, I think one school you did not list was Inver Hills.
Yeah.
Are they here?
Not that I can see.
Here comes Ava. What about Duluth? Do we have people here from University of Minnesota Duluth?
Yep.
That would be Calvin. Yes, great. Okay, super. I think everybody is represented. So one more time, we're going to do these lessons. The recordings will be available. You can share the recordings. You should share the recordings with your teammates. But as the representative of your team who is here, and most teams don't have everybody here, one of your responsibilities is to tell them what happened and help them decide, possibly by spreading the load, who's going to work on what, who's going to read what, who's going to watch what videos to get ready for next week's lesson. So I'm going to put back in the chat because I think it doesn't show up if you join after I put it in. So I'll put it in again. I want you to go to this Google Drive. And the reason is on this Google Drive, I'm going to go to this Google Drive. You can do so at your convenience. But there's a list of materials that I've posted. And what I'm going to do literally is I'm going to go through everything that's on that list and tell you why it's posted and encourage you to spend some perhaps extra time with it. Our plan here is to be done by 6:30, so 1 hour. Hold me to that. But what that does mean is I'm going to go fast, and Kelly, when it's her turn, is going to go fast. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to, here I am. This is where you'll get to. And you'll notice there's a lot of things posted here, and most of them start with the number 1. A few of them start with the number 0. A couple of them at the end start with the number 2. The number just means this is the week in which this was posted, or this is the week this pertains to. So we are doing lesson 1, week 1. And so most of these things are 1. On the other hand, 0, the adult media release, at some point I'm going to ask each team to sign that we're allowed to take pictures of you. Okay, and that will happen when we're launching our rockets, and that might have already happened last Saturday. Also, 0 remote rocketry lessons. I'm just reading down from the top. Okay, so the schedule for the lessons, there was a copy of this in the materials that was handed out, and so you have this in writing already, but I would encourage you to go there, and we're doing lesson 1. In fact, if I click on that, basically it says, here it is, lesson 1, rocket concepts, parts of the kit, tote, epoxy practice. That's basically what we're doing, okay? So, here's what I can do. I can actually click through the things right here, so I'll just do that. First of all, this is something worth talking about. On Saturday, we built and flew some model rockets. This is what they looked like, okay? So you already have one of these built, probably. And so here is the information from these flights. And just for fun, let's take a really quick look at this information. Let me open this in Google Sheets so I can see it a little bit better. Let me see if I can make this panel go away.
So while you're doing that, I want to point out one thing. St. John's made their rocket look very pretty. They wrapped different things around it and had a lot of drag on it. So if you notice, their top speed is typically lower than everybody else's, which means their highest altitude is also going to be a lot lower.
I'm sorry, St. Thomas?
St. John's.
St. John's, got it. So St. John's flew 2 rockets, and
Yep.
one of them went more than twice as high as the other. And so that's an interesting thing to look at right there. Okay, so Kelly thinks she understands why this one was so low. I'm fascinated by why this one is so high. And the reason is, supposedly these were all identical rocket motors, and yet this one went 20% higher than the rest of them, suggesting that you had a pretty serious motor there. I point this out because not all motors are created equal. On the other hand, this one was cheating. This was Kelly's rocket, but this was a different kind of motor. So that went hundreds of feet higher because it was a B motor instead of an A motor. Let me just point out a couple other things. I would encourage you to spend some time with this, but notice that several rockets noted that their shock cord broke. And some of the ones where their shock cord broke, they came down kind of fast, 18 miles an hour instead of 10 miles an hour. On the other hand, here's one where the shock cord broke and it came down at 7 miles an hour. That's interesting too. That kind of suggests, well, if you believe the numbers, it's possible that the data logger was misbehaving, but if you believe the numbers, that kind of suggests that these rockets have a fair amount of drag if you break them open and you don't really need a parachute at all. So not going to spend any more time on this, but I just want to point out, I posted it. Century didn't manage to collect any data, and Duluth didn't fly the rocket, and that was with my permission. So the rest of these rockets were essentially similar, including one that I built myself the following day. Sad story. The rocket that I built the following day, I took it out on campus a couple days later, and I lost it into the Mississippi River. And the reason that happened is because we were flying to 100 feet, which was the tree line. And then I decided to put a B motor in and fly to 300 feet. And above the tree line, there was a heavy wind that I did not anticipate. And it took my rocket and carried it right into the river. And so that rocket is no more.
On the bright side, the landing was soft.
The landing was soft. That's true. And it will show up in the Gulf of Mexico at some point. Okay, continuing on. These are the things that are posted. Here's a document that's posted that explains what you see when you look at the screen shots from an altimeter 2. You should look over that, especially if you're not sure what it means, apogee to coast to, whatever it's, what is that all about? Okay. Here are the instructions for building that model rocket. You've been through these instructions already. I sort of regret having encouraged you to use an elastic cord, which turned out to be on the short side and not quite strong enough to survive some of the flights. So I'm teaching a freshman class here, and I chose a couple days later to build the same set of rockets, and we didn't use the elastic cord, we used the original cord, and guess what? We didn't break any. On the other hand, I know we would have broken off some of the nose cones had we not modified the nose cones to accommodate the heavy-duty cord. So there was breaking coming unless you build these often enough to fix it. That's why I made some modifications even to your rocket build.
And I still have the thicker elastic cord.
Okay. We need longer cord, frankly, and thicker perhaps. What happened on these cords is that they were 18 inches long. We used a bit of that for the knots, and then they essentially expanded until they couldn't expand anymore. And then once you're not elastic, then being elastic doesn't help you, and you hit your limit and you snap the cord. At least a few of them snap, not all of them. Here's an interesting, this is an animations document. This is actually worth taking a look. So let's just take a quick look at how model rocket motors burn. And so here's the idea. You have a model rocket with essentially gunpowder, packed black powder. It burns from the end. So you light it at one end and it burns from the bottom. This is the nozzle up to the top. And then it burns through the delay grain, which slows. It generates smoke, but not thrust. Okay. And then above the delay grain is fine black powder, which will cause an explosion. So let's just walk through this quick. Here we go. We put in the igniter. We put in a cap to hold it in place. We apply electricity. It starts a fire. Okay. And then the fire essentially starts at the bottom of the motor and burns to the top. That's the thrusting phase. And then slowly through the delay grain, that's the smoking phase. And then the explosion. Okay. So that is the pressurization phase, pressurizing the inside of the rocket so as to get your parachute out. Spend some time with that animation. It's actually quite instructive, and you can read the words. I'm just going quickly here. On the other hand, here is how a high power rocket motor burns. It's somewhat different. The first thing I notice that's different is that there's a hole drilled all the way to the top of the motor. So I don't light this motor at the bottom. I light this motor at the top, and then it burns the full length of the motor from the middle out, not from the bottom up, but from the middle out. Here we go. With the animation, here comes the igniter all the way to the top of the motor. Apply your electricity to get it lit. You light it at the top, and then promptly it starts to light the entire length of the motor. And then it burns out. And then, as was the case before, there's a delay grain, which smokes and delays the explosion until several seconds later. So the delay grain continues to burn and smoke. And then there is an ejection charge, a motor eject at the very top. And it explodes and pressurizes the rocket and breaks it open and gets out the first of possibly more than one parachute. Okay, spend some time with that YouTube channel, basically that YouTube video as well. It's short, but I won't take time to watch it now. It just shows the fact that different kinds of motors have different propellants, which burn with different colors, which is kind of cute. And they have different performance as well. Here's instructions to build an Arcus rocket. We're not building this rocket. This is the first rocket I ever built, in fact, and I like these instructions. And so I've posted instructions for a couple of rockets for you to consider, but we're going to instruct you orally on how to build the rocket that you have in your kit, but I think it's worth knowing that there's other ways to do certain steps. So here's one of 2 instruction booklets I've posted. I'm going to get back to this, but this is a technical report written in the 60s about how to calculate stability for rockets. It's actually good reading. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes of theory toward the end of this mini lecture, shall we say, and it will be based on this particular technical report, the Behlen report. And here are the slides to go along with that mini lecture, which are based on the Behlen report. So listen to my 5 minutes, take a look at these slides, and if you want to, you can go and read the full report, and or you can look at my hand-drawn calculation. I'm not going to do calculations in front of you, but I did some calculations and I have them posted here. You can see how I, by hand, calculated center of pressure, center of mass, stability of a rocket. In actuality, one would probably do that sort of thing either with a spreadsheet, if you did it yourself, not by hand, because it's very repetitive, or else just use a program, a simulation program that has these equations built into it. We will be doing that in a later session.
Are you referring to Open Rocket?
We will use Open Rocket. That's not the only thing out there, but Open Rocket is free. On the other hand, there's RockSim, which is a little bit better and a little bit cooler and quite a bit more expensive, as in $100 instead of free. I'm not expecting people to buy RockSim. I've used Open Rocket reasonably successfully for quite a long time. Again, plowing through the things that are posted. Here's a picture from the book. The book? What book? Well, it turns out that there were 2 books in your tote, or else you declared that you already had the books. So this is a picture of the innards of a high-power rocket, and I'll show you one in a moment, but I can tell this is a dual deploy rocket. Dual in this case means 2 parachutes, and I can see 2 parachutes in this picture. You should understand, and we'll go through the names of many of the things in this and other rockets in a moment. Other things I posted. Yes, this is important. Here's the homework. For each lesson, there's going to be a vocabulary and a homework or something along those lines. So here's the homework, and if I step one more, here's the vocabulary. We'll go through this full list in a moment, but back to the homework. Just kind of a heads up. There's the link to the repository that I'm stepping through. There's some reading. You could all do the reading, or you could assign 1 or 2 people. You do the reading and report back on what you've learned, okay? You should go through the tote. In fact, people mostly did this on Saturday, and let us know if there's anything you can't find. We're going to look through the tote in a minute. And then you should think about the static margin exercise. I will talk through the theory of that very briefly, and then I have already pointed out that I've posted several things along the lines what that theory is about. And then at the very bottom, we'll get back to this at the very end of tonight's lesson. We do have a very small hands-on activity. Okay, we're calling it the fin-can/epoxy exercise. Kelly will step you through that in a few minutes. It's all in the homework slide. This, on the other hand, is the vocabulary slide. And this is going to be a little rough, but we just got a lot of vocabulary that we need to get under our belt. Some of it we did mention on Saturday. There are more vocabulary terms than we talked about on Saturday, but now they're in writing. And so I'm going to literally go through this entire list. It's reasonably long, and point out with rockets in front of me, what is that? What is that? What is that? What is that called? You might want to have this particular vocabulary slide up while I'm doing that.
Now, that being said, after a while, these are just things that you just know. You'll talk about the static margin, which is the difference between the center of pressure and the center of gravity. And it's just going to be things that are part of your vocabulary once you get to know it. So don't stress out about not understanding all these right off the bat. As you build, you'll get to understand hands-on what each of these means and why.
Good point. Good point. This becomes second nature, but not yet. It'll take a little while. Okay, continuing on here to other things that I've posted, and somehow it's not forwarding. There we go. Yes. Here is a link to photos of what was in the tote. And I think I may have also, maybe I'm looking for it. Yes, here is the actual photos of what's in the tote. Okay, so let me go back. This is how you can go directly to this link if you want to see the photos from the tote, but you have that in hard copy already. Here's the Miranda rocket. This is another set of instructions from a different company, which I also like. Somewhat different from the instructions that were in the first rocket and somewhat different from how we're going to teach this rocket, but when all is said and done, if you pay attention, you will know how to build rockets several different ways, and you can start to choose what you prefer. Here's the pictures from the tote. I just put this together yesterday. This was a model rocketry to high power rocketry. What are some of the differences? This is an important slide. I encourage you to spend some time with it. Model rocketry means flying on A through G motors, where every time you change your letter, you double your energy. Basically, you double your fuel. So B is twice as much as A, C is twice as much as B, etc. A through G is considered model rocketry. H and above is high power rocketry. And the way you build them is similar, but what you build them with is different. So in one case, you might use wood glue. In the other case, you would use two-component epoxy. In one case, you might use balsa. In the other case, you might use fiberglass for your fins, for instance. So here's a list of what you might do in model rocketry and a comparable list of high-power rocketry. And you'll see that high-power rocketry is much stronger materials, and it's a longer list, frankly. Spend a little bit of time with that. Those two pictures are not to scale. The model rocket is much smaller physically than the high power rocket. Here's a list of places that I buy things from. You don't have to buy anything yet. And the reason you don't have to buy anything yet is because I gave you a bunch of stuff. But if you're going to continue with rocketry or build more than one rocket or want to do a few things that are cooler than what I'm having you do here, there will be some optional parts which might require you to buy some things. Here's where I would go looking for parts.
Have Rocket Man on that list?
I do. Basically, Rocket Man is in Bloomington, interestingly enough. There he is. And he sells lots of things, especially parachutes. And so I actually buy parachutes more often from Top Flight because they're thinner. But it turns out you want tough parachutes. Rocket Man is a good place to go. These ones, Mad Cow, Always Ready Rocketry, Mac Performance Rocketry, these are places that sell kits. In fact, the kit we're building is from Always Ready Rocketry.
Do you mind if I say something quick about Mac Performance?
One moment. Of the two things I posted, the Miranda rocket is PML. So that's instruction from this company. And the Arcus rocket is Mad Cow. So that's instructions from this company. Oddly enough, Always Ready Rocketry does not give instructions with any of their rockets. So we're going to teach how to build this rocket orally. But Kelly has something to say about Mac Performance.
So also, LOC or Look Precision, I've built a couple of their things. They're really good kits. As far as Mac Performance Rocketry goes, it's literally ma and pa. It's a guy and his wife, and he will manufacture custom kits for you if you've got the specifications. So really awesome set of people. And if you are looking for somewhere that builds amazing kits, Mac Performance does a really, really good job of it.
Very cool. I'm going to actually put in a plug for two other things that are on this list. The second of which is Apogee Components. Pretty much when I look for parts, this is where I often look first. But Off We Go Rocketry is in town. This is the person, Gary Stroik, who runs the rocket launches here. You will meet him, and he's the one you need to buy motors from because he has motors here. You don't want to buy motors in California and have them shipped hazardous materials across the country. Just buy them from Gary. And so Off We Go Rocketry, that's something you want to get used to knowing about if you do rocketry here in Minnesota. Many of the things that I bought for you for these kits, the altimeter 2s, the forged eye bolts and stuff, I got them from Gary. I buy from him when I can, but he doesn't sell everything. He sells motors. That's the main thing that I get from him, not kits.
And if he looks at something on your build and he seems concerned about it, listen to his advice because he's got more than all of us in this room combined.
Good point. Here are two figures, both from the High Power Rocketry book. There's a book on model rocketry and a book on high power rocketry. The single deploy means a single parachute. You boost, you coast after your motor is burned out until you reach apogee, the top, and then you come back down under one parachute, which comes out at the top because of an explosion. That's called single deploy. It says flight of a typical high power rocket. Frankly, this is flight of a typical high power or model rocket, as long as it's single deploy. And then here is a dual deploy rocket. It does very much the same thing, pulling out one parachute at the top, but then it must have sensors on board to know it's reaching close to the ground. And then you program it to say, oh, when you get 750 feet above the ground, time for the second parachute, and you pull out a bigger parachute so that you land more gently. That would be considered dual deploy, dual parachutes. Almost done here with this list. Oh, wow, what's this? Oh, yes. now I'm into week 2. So you don't have to look at this. Let me just point out, let me go to the very last thing that I posted. Here is a 9-minute, this is very cool, a 9-minute video showing building of a specific high power rocket called an SWR-300 rocket. And here is a list of how I would schedule the build of that rocket. And one thing we're going to ask you to do next week is think through pretty much the entire build and then write a schedule. You might want to take a look at this schedule and maybe even adapt this schedule to fit your rocket. You'll notice the schedule is sort of non-trivial. It goes and goes and goes, but basically that's because there's a bunch of steps to building any rocket. This schedule was essentially built by watching the 9-minute video, but that's actually week 2. So I'm ahead of myself. Stop, share. Fine, so that's everything that's been posted and kind of why I posted it. Now it's up to you to decide how to try to ingest that information, and you might not succeed one person in 1 week, but you've got a team and you've got more than 1 week. Definitely try to get some people to look at all the different things and then maybe compare notes and say, oh yeah, we all should really read that chapter. That was pretty good, but that video, we don't all need to watch it, but a couple people do because they're the ones who are going to benefit from it. Fine. Next thing for me, and that is, I'm going to go through that vocabulary list. Also, very fast. Okay, so here's the deal. I have the vocabulary list in my hand, and I have some rockets nearby. And I've already started talking about a bunch of these things. So you might want to pull up the vocabulary list because I'm looking at it and I won't necessarily show it on the screen. But what I want to in particularly do is take a look at the parts, which start about halfway down the first page. Looking at my vocabulary list, we've already talked about the fact that model rocketry and high power rocketry are defined by the kinds of motors you burn, H, high power and above, okay? We have the gunpowder motors, end burning motors versus the ammonium perchlorate center burning motors. We've already seen a little bit of that. We saw single deploy figures. We saw that the motor burns and then you coast and then you reach apogee and then you descend. We've already seen all of these things actually. Let me show you my split rocket. So here's a question, Kelly. If I, spotlight for everyone, let me try that. Am I maybe bigger right now on your screen? Maybe I've been big all along.
You've been big all along.
Okay, that's fine. I'm big on my screen too. This is good. So let me just show you what I've got here. And the answer is I've got a bunch of rockets. Here's the model. Whoa, that's weird. If I tip this thing too much, it flips upside down. Okay, I guess I won't tip it too much. Here's the model, okay? And then here and right behind it is essentially a high power rocket that's very much like the model. It just happens to be bigger, but it flies with a single nose cone that you blow off. And then the split rocket. So the split rocket here is a single rocket, which was sawed in half. And the close version, oh shoot, this is weird. I just bought this camera and I did not realize it was going to do that. Okay, so let me just tell you about this rocket. The motor goes here. Down here is a single parachute, so I can tell this is a single deploy rocket. And then the upper section is what gets blown off when the time is right, and the single parachute brings it down. The second rocket behind starts much the same with the motor and a parachute close to it, but then it has an avionics bay, and then it has another parachute, which is kind of jammed in right above the avionics bay. When the avionics bay says time for the second parachute, it's going to blow off the nose cone, which actually brings out this second parachute. So single deploy, whoa, single deploy, dual deploy, both set up in the same rocket shell. So this kind of tells you that when you buy a rocket, you can kind of sometimes choose whether it's going to be single deploy or dual deploy after the fact. Although if you want a dual deploy, you might want to buy one that's intended for that. Okay, that's my split rocket. We got parachutes, which have a canopy. That's the top part and shroud lines. This is just easy vocabulary. We're going to put these things together with two-component epoxy. I've given you rocket epoxy, okay? And I've also given you JB Weld, which happens to be an epoxy, significantly more expensive, but better for high temperature applications. And so it turns out that things that are close to the burning motor might get hot, and rocket epoxy might not do so well when things get hot. So JB Weld would be appropriate for certain parts, especially at the very base of the rocket. When you take a fin, so let me just take a look at this fin. This fin actually is just built onto the surface of the rocket. So that's would be called a surface mount, although this one was not glued on, this was fabricated this way. On the other hand, the fins over here, in this case, the fin goes inside the rocket and is glued on the inside as well as on the outside. So there's a slot in the airframe and the fin goes into the slot and you glue it inside and outside, and that's stronger. So that's called through hole. That's how the most high power rockets are built. We'll be using epoxy. That's permanent, so be careful. You don't epoxy something until you're really sure. So you might have to be thoughtful about, in fact, Kelly will emphasize this next week especially, make sure you do this first and that second and that third, because once you epoxy it, it's essentially permanent. I'll get back to center of gravity and center of pressure in a minute, but basically you need the rocket to want to fly nose first. And so the way to do that is to set up where its gravitational balance point is compared to its air force balance point. And the difference between those two is referred to as the static margin, and it's usually reported in diameters of the rocket. So you want your center of mass, the gravitational balance point, to be at least one full diameter forward, not aft of, but forward toward the top of the rocket, forward of the center of pressure, which is the air force balance point. Flight readiness review. I haven't posted that either. I'm going to have you fill out a real basic report and use that when you check out your rocket. So I will post that maybe in week 2, I guess. And so we won't step through it tonight at all, but that's coming. I will give you a template, and I want you to use the template to help present your rocket to me. So here we go, quickly. I'm just going to take a look at a rocket from the top to the bottom. So let me look at this dual deploy rocket right here. So the first thing, whoa, is a nose cone. And then at the base of the nose cone, I'm going to put in an eye bolt so that I can attach things to it. In this particular case, I attach shock cord to that. And then the parachute is attached to the shock cord, and the flame protector is attached to the shock cord, possibly with a quick link so I can take them apart. As I continue down here, I'm getting towards my avionics bay. There's a bulk plate, which would go all the way around the rocket if it was not split in half. And above the bulk plate, I see a place for ejection charges, for explosive charges. I see wiring that goes to the avionics on the inside, which can tell that explosive charge to go off. This is called a sled. I didn't provide you with a sled, but I provide you with the things to go on your sled. You'll have to figure that out for yourself. And this sled is actually mounted on, it's a little hard to see here, a piece of threaded rod. So the threaded rod here will support the sled and keep things from moving around. The threaded rod goes all the way to the bottom. There's more explosive charges at the bottom. There's a second parachute at the bottom. There's more shock cord. There's more recovery harness. And then there's another eye bolt way at the bottom here. That's how it's attached. This is called a motor mount tube, and it's held in the middle of the airframe with this centering ring. And the centering ring is epoxied in, and the fins are epoxied in to the inside and all the way into the motor mount tube. So the motor sits inside of that tube. And then at the very bottom of the rocket, I probably should show this on a different rocket. At the very bottom, let me show it on a real rocket here. The motor is in here, and then we have to retain it. We have to make sure it doesn't get kicked out. Okay, so I have given you in your tote stuff you need for building a motor retention system. That's almost everything on my list. It turns out that we might put some things inside of our nose cone, like a radio beeper, like a altimeter 2, a data logger. Okay, that said, we might need to, oops, let me show you this nose cone. Sorry. This nose cone here has a hole built in it. And the reason the hole is there is so that I can attach a eye bolt, a forged eye bolt, and also so I can get inside of the nose cone to put things inside, like an altimeter 2, perhaps. So we might be making some modifications to our nose cones, including making holes in them so we can get things inside. We also might, one moment, let me grab one. Show you 2 things. I had these out on Saturday also. Here's a sled. So the idea is the sled sits on top of the threaded rods, either with tubes or there's other ways to attach sleds. has a battery, has an altimeter that can fire ejection charges. And then here is a 3D printed case in which you can put a camera. I will lend you the camera if you want to put a camera mount on your rocket. That's an optional part, but I will be supportive of you doing it. I will even provide the camera. You just don't get to keep the camera. I should point out that the motors we use, unlike the model rocket motor, which is this big, or the size of your finger, okay? The motors we use will be about this big. This happens to be an I motor. We'll use an H motor, it's a little tiny bit smaller. And sometimes the motors require cases, metal cases, and sometimes they don't. This is a motor that doesn't require a case. This motor I'm providing you does require a case, so I provided you with a case. Well, they're from different companies, and so sometimes they're caseless, and sometimes they require cases.
And here is what an H or I case looks like. This is a 54 millimeter.
Ah, so that's much bigger in diameter. I don't think I-
Much bigger.
Yes, I do have one.
And these secure a little differently. So you'll notice that the H that he was holding up, it secures a little differently on the end where the actual motor screws into the end. But on the H's, you've got a cap that goes on the end. So the motor gets slotted in and then you have to screw on the cap. Whereas on the other ones, you actually take the motor and screw it directly into the casing.
Okay, so the motor we'll use will be like this. It will screw into the case. It will stick out a little tiny bit. Other motors, Kelly was mentioning, which are bigger in diameter, the motor fully goes into the case and then you have to use this extra piece to hold it in. $50 just for that piece. Good thing that the cases don't get thrown away. They're called reloads. You have to reload the propellant, but you use the cases over and over again. Fine. And then inside of a motor, there might be individual motor grains. I don't happen to have any motors that are opened up to see the grains. You wouldn't
And
normally
Dr.
see the
Flaten?
grains. Yep,
We're down to the last 20 minutes.
we are. So that means time for you. And here's what you can do, Kelly. I'd like you to,
I can give a quick overview of all I've got the fins. You
here's
want
what I
to
want you to, I want you to focus on, I'm gonna highlight myself. I want you to focus on the kit. And the reason is everybody got their tote and teams were actually supposed to on Saturday look through their tote. So how about, don't worry about the tote so much because people have already been looking at that. Let's replace and
I was simply going to focus on the the centering rings, the self-centering plywood bulk plates, the shock cord, stuff like that. I don't know if you wanted me to do that.
I'm trying to spotlight you so we can see what you're looking at. Please go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, so one thing, just so we get this out of the way, because Dr. Flaten wants to make sure we don't forget about this. You'll find in your kit that you have this little tube right here, and you've got 4 little fins. On top of that, you're going to have this mixture in there called rocket epoxy. Oh, that doesn't show up very well. Rocket epoxy. So there's 2 containers. One of them is a resin and one of them is a hardener. And what you're going to do with that is we want you to try to just take 2 of these fins and put them on as nice, straight, and perfect as you can with no extra knowledge of how to do it. Just take them, epoxy them to this, try to line them up nice at the bottom there and try to get it so that they are vertical and that they're not off to the side. So you don't want anything wonky. With that, you can see 2 of these on a previous one are mostly level with each other, and the other 2 are not. So you can see kind of they don't line up with each other. So what you want to do is you first want to try to do the 2 yourself, and you want to see exactly how difficult this whole process is. If you look closely, you can see it was pretty difficult for them to get a good epoxy seam right there. After we're done here, you're going to learn how to make that real nice. That fillet is what it's called. It's going to be nice. It's going to be clean. So one of your first tasks is going to be to take that that tube and throw 2 of those on there with the rocket epoxy. you're not going to need nearly as much as you think you are because you have the 2 containers. So make sure to take 1 container, mix up just a small amount of that with the same amount from the other container, mix it really well till it turns kind of a gray color, and then use that to apply your fins. It will only be usable for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, depending on the temperature that you're working in. Don't work on it below 60 degrees. It's unworkable. So try to focus on that.
On the other hand, here's what I would like you to do, though. I would like you to keep stirring it every 5 minutes, just a little bit, for an hour, or until you can't really stir it anymore. That'll give you a sense for how long you have. Kelly kind of gave it away. It might be about 20 minutes, but by 40 minutes, by 60 minutes, it will become unusable. And so that tells you you don't have to use it instantly, but you do have to use it pretty soon after you mix it up.
So you're also in your kit, if you're following along with your guide, you're going to see that right next to that is a self-centering plywood bulk plates. That's these guys. And you'll notice that there are different sizes. There's kind of a little step here. What that step is, that's actually the inner size of the body tube. I'm going to use the smaller, the piston one, but essentially one of these will go in and the other one will sit on top of it. And then you'll repeat that process on the other side. Your holes are going to be what you put your sled on. So the 2 outer holes are going to go to the sled. The middle hole is going to go to an eye bolt that goes to the shock cord we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's what that.
So Kelly, we'll talk about all these build steps next week. That's the entire lesson next week is how to build it. It's good for you to show the parts, but we'll do the building, talking about the building details next week.
Okay. Shock cord. When we did ours a couple of years ago, the shock cords were abysmal. They ended up separating in a couple different conditions. Essentially, you're going to have this line right up next to the exhaust on the motor, and this is going to be extending all the way up to the section that separates up next, which is going to be either the avionics bay if you're doing a dual deploy, or you have electronics, or it's just going to be the nose cone. So this has to hold the parts of the body together, and if you don't have a good, strong, reliable shock cord, it's going to get melted through with that exhaust. The exhaust will be quite aggressive. It can definitely punch holes in your nylon parachutes. It can do a whole bunch of stuff. It can separate out the cord.
So it's not the exhaust from the nozzle. This is the exhaust from the explosion.
Yep.
Okay, these are the explosions that happen inside your rocket, and you have to make sure that things that are not explosive happy need to be protected from those explosions as best as possible, like parachutes.
So we've got 2 different types of parachutes here. We have one that's called a drogue. You'll see it's quite tiny, very thin. And then we've got one which is your main parachute. So the drogue parachute is going to be the first one that comes out. It's going to be coming out right around apogee. You know, it takes a couple feet down from that. It'll be coming out at apogee. And the reason we don't want to have this one in most conditions is because if you're going 5, 7, 10, whatever 1,000 feet up, you want to come down pretty quickly before you open a main parachute, because you don't want this thing to drift miles and miles. So essentially, when you've got the drogue chute, you've got a good enough speed decrease on your way down. That'll get you to about 500 feet, 300 feet, and then this one will eject open and we'll have a 40, 45, 48, whatever inch thing that will bring us down under about 23 feet per second when it hits the ground. And that's really kind of considered a safe range. Now, in order to not burn holes through these with our shock cord too, we're going to have the different types of shock cloth. Some of them are Nomex. I prefer the Nomex ones. I really like the Rocket Man ones. That's that company we were talking about. All sorts of different protectors that you can go with. It doesn't really matter what you use as long as it can protect the parachutes from the exhaust coming off of these charges. And it's not only going to be the exhaust coming off of the motor ejection, it's also exhaust coming off or the burn coming off of the black powder charges on the upper half or the upper stage if you're doing dual deployment. With the drogue chute, you've been given some yellow kind of cord, shock cord. You can use this to go up and over the top of the chute in multiple directions and bring that down. You can sew that into there to strengthen those lines so it doesn't separate on you.
It turns out we chose the wrong parachute. That was intentional. We chose a small parachute, but it's a small and light parachute, and you need a small and heavy parachute. So you need to make that parachute stronger. We will talk about that in significant more detail next week.
So before we even leave the ground, we're gonna have to be on we're using 10-15 rails. That's what they are, isn't it?
10-10.
10-10 rails. Okay, so 10-10 rails, it's not gonna be like these small ones we used where we just have a little rod and we put the thing down on there and then it shoots off. It's gonna be this big thing, and you can Google it. It's called a 10-10 rod. You're essentially going to be dealing with this little space in between, and you slide these little things, buttons, or these rails in your kit. Oh, that doesn't work too well. These rails down this, basically down this thing, this little guide, and they'll be sitting. So that's how your rocket sits on there. And when it launches, it goes straight through that, comes up and off of those rail systems. So if you're doing high-powered rocketry at all, you're going to need to have these little rail buttons, or you're going to need to have rail guides, and you have each in your kit. You can make a decision which one you use. Now, if you have anybody who's ever built a rocket before and they've already used one, or they like one more than the other, try to use the other one that you haven't used at all. Like, use this as an experience to get as much out of it as possible. If you've not used either, you can build with one of each if you'd like to. My personal opinion on this is rail buttons. These things secure by a plate on the inside of the rocket body, and they kind of screw down. You don't need to align them very well because it's a circle, so they just need to go on the body. Whereas the rail guides, these little guys have to be lined up perfectly straight along the body vertically, and you have to make sure that you secure them in such a way that they don't come off the surface of the body of the rocket. So it's a little bit of personal preference, but I really do recommend that you try to use both techniques if you have the chance, or one that you haven't used before in that condition. So
it turns out we've given you more than you need to build this rocket. There's a pair of rail guides and a pair of rail buttons, and you could even choose to use one of each.
So we've gotten you're on the pad, you've launched off, you're off the rail. You're up there and your rocket separates, and you've got your shock cords and you've got your parachutes, and you're ready, but everything comes apart. And the reason everything comes apart is because you haven't secured it with different pieces that you're going to need in order to make sure that each part is not only separable from each other, but also that they stay connected as a whole unit via the shock cord. So you're going to have one of these way down at the bottom, and that's going to be built right into your fin can assembly. The shock cord is going to come out of that, going to come up, and it's going to come up to either the nose cone if it's just a single deploy, or it's going to come up to the avionics bay, which is what we're going to do. You'll have another one. And then that on the other end of that, you'll have another one. And that will connect to another shock cord, and that will go to the nose cone. So you're going to have 4 of these in a dual deploy setup as a minimum. Now, if you build this thing with 4 of these and just shock cords, you're going to find that you can't really like transport this very easy, work on it very easy, because it's all just one big thing. And you can kind of pull a part of it away from you, but it's always going to have that shock cord attached. So some people find it nice to attach these. You throw one of these on your eye bolt, and then that way you can put your parachute connected to that. And if you need to, you can disconnect parts, and it makes it easier for moving it around, hauling it places if you want to, or even just working on it, because you can get that shock cord out of the way and focus on the parts that you need. So you'll have a number of these in your kit, and you'll have a number of these. You'll also have a really weird looking one, this guy right here. So this is actually if you want to use a piston setup. You'll have another whole set of these eye bolts in there, because the piston will be connected at the bottom to the shock cord that's connected at the fin can assembly. Then this side will then connect to your avionics bay. So it just depends on how you want to connect everything, but it's all one long string, kind of a backbone of shock cord connected to different parts. And we'll explain when we get to it exactly how much shock cord you want to use per section. Couple other things.
One quick comment, and that is the quick links allow you to disconnect things, but if you tie the shock cord, you can untie it. You just
Mhm.
always have to tie things really, really, really carefully.
I like to use quick links, and instead of just tying, I like to secure it with a little epoxy so it never goes anywhere and it never unties. It's a personal preference though. You've got a little kit and it's got a bunch of wires in it. It has a bunch of quick connect, disconnect parts for your wiring. And also in there, and make sure you use a lot of care with this thing. It's in a shock bag. You don't want to damage this. This is your altimeter. This is an AIM USB altimeter. Used a couple different types, and easily my favorite one is the AIM USB altimeter. This thing, it's so easy to set up, and the wiring is so like visual, and you just see it, and it's just there. So this is going to be what we're going to be using to fire off our charges. This does not, this is not our data logger. You know, the other one says that it's an altimeter, but it's not. It's just a data logger. And this one is going to be, it does data log, but we don't want to depend on that for this particular aspect. We'll pull data on that later, but this is going to be what tells your parachutes when to deploy. Last couple parts, you'll notice this in your kit. And if you're astute, you'll notice that it's just threaded all the way down, which is why it's called an all thread. You're not going to need the whole thing in one go. You're going to need to find a way to separate this out into even sections. And you're going to take it, and that's going to be what makes your rail. So you're going to be putting that through there, and that's going to create your rail. So it says it's 36 inches on there. Don't freak out. It's about 24 inches. They probably
we cut them down. We gave you 2 feet. I stole the last 1 foot for my own purposes. You don't need even 2 feet.
And the last few things. So I had said that we would fire off this charge that will open up the upper half of your rocket. Well, in order for that to happen, you have to first have a black powder charge. And second, you have to have somewhere to keep it and to make sure that it goes in the direction you want it to. So you'll notice that there are a couple little metal caps in there, little copper caps. You're going to want to screw a hole or drill a hole through that, and you'll screw that directly to the bulk plates. And in the hollow in the inside, you're just going to put that charge in there, and that's what's going to pop the parachute out for us. Last item.
So the good news, the bad news. The good news is that we're using explosives. The bad news is you don't get the explosives. We have the explosives, and we'll pull them out when the time is right.
So the last item you might have kind of found was weird. It seemed like a door alarm setup, and I don't know if you've taken a look at that yet. So the thing about this is, as long as you've got it turned off, it's not going to make noises, but there's a little thing inside that you can then turn on, and that's going to be what you want to stow in the upper part of your rocket. You're going to want to securely stow it, and you're going to want to turn it on before you launch. What that's going to do is it's going to give you an extra layer of, hey, where is my rocket? So if it lands in a place that you just can't see or you can't find, tall grass, it maybe landed in a tree somewhere, hopefully you'll be able to hear that audible tone, and that audible tone will then guide you to where your rocket is when you can't physically see it. I think I've pretty much covered everything. The one thing I would add, when you start to get like artistic with your fillets, you're going to want to have a couple different types of like tongue depressors, popsicle sticks. Your radius of your fillet is going to be predicated on the radius of your popsicle stick or your tongue depressor. So if you want larger ones, you're going to need to get a larger tongue depressor. If you want smaller ones, you're going to have to get a smaller tongue depressor. That being said, the bigger ones are easier to sand. They're easier to smooth down and to kind of merge into the body. So if you want to have a really nice, clean presentation, you want to have a rocket that goes nice and high because the drag is low, then get yourself something bigger.
It turns out I think we were supposed to have put some spoons in there. Maybe we forgot to, but I sometimes make fillets and shape them with my fingers in a glove or with a spoon. And so you can find things that have a curvature which would allow you to get your fillets, as Kelly mentioned, nice and smooth. That's important. Here's what I'm going to do. Getting close to the end of our time here. That's fine. I'm just going to give you some motivational theory. So back to my rocket, I'll use the small rocket. They all work the same as far as physics goes. Some are just bigger than others. When the motor is loaded, that's extra weight at the base, and then I can find the gravitational balance point. So this would be the center of gravity or the center of mass, approximately here. And then if I were to put this thing up as a wind vane on a barn or something, it's like, yeah, the wind will definitely push more on the fins than it will on the upper section. And so the center of pressure, you can calculate these things, but the center of pressure, which will be dominated by the location of the fins, will be closer to the fins. So if the center of mass is here and the center of pressure is here, that's perhaps 2 diameters apart.
Or static
That would be-
margins.
That would be called the static margin of 2 caliber. Okay, so the slides that I mentioned but didn't step through show you how to do a center of mass calculation, which you may well already know if you've taken physics. Basically, it's a weighted calculation of adding up the masses and the locations of all the parts. Okay, and then the center of pressure is a similar calculation. You just have to use a coefficient that tells you something about the pressure on a specific part. And in fact, I'm not so worried. I'm thinking about air forces, and I'm not so worried about drag forces. I'm worried more about sideways forces. And here's the reason. As a rocket is flying, once the thrust is finished, it will have a tendency to possibly wiggle about the center of mass. And so I want to make sure that if it's going up and yet it tips over and it's still going up, the air catches it and corrects it. And then the air catches it and corrects it. So in both cases, as long as the center of pressure is farther behind, farther aft than the center of mass, the thing will have a tendency to want to fly nose first. And if it were to actually fall out of the sky tail first, it will flip and fall nose first. In other words, it's stable and it wants to go nose first. That's an important thing to calculate in advance. It will happen with a model of this sort that's sold because someone did the calculation. But if you were to build something, quote, from scratch and make decisions yourself about how big it is and how long it is and how wide it is, you should figure out whether or not it's going to be stable, preferably before you've put in too much investment on building it, lest you build something that wouldn't be allowed to be flown, because the people who run the launch will check and they will ask you questions and they will check whether something is stable. And if it's unstable, they will forbid it from being flown. I think that's all we've got time for. So here's what I'm going to do.
You have
I'm
a
gonna-
couple quick things, if you don't mind.
Please.
Anybody else that came in, please amend your name to include your school. And also, I've noticed that Dr. Flaten is having to forward me a bunch of the data things. So in the future, if you could just include both of us, then he wouldn't have to forward those over.
Of course. So she's the TA. We want her to get all the data and all the interaction. So copy her, copy me every time you are doing correspondence related to this particular project. So we're at 6:30. So call it a night. Although if anybody wants to, I'm happy to stay on. I'll leave the recording running in case there are any questions, but
Rocketry
mostly-
competition.
Oh, yes, thank you, rocketry competition. So here's what I'll do. I will add 2 things to the posted area. One is about the rocketry competition. We just announced rules for that, and so you can take a look at those slides. Maybe I'll say some words about them next week once the slides have been posted, but more or less in the springtime, teams of students who work over the course of the year, sometimes fall spring, sometimes just spring, but in the late spring next year, we will get together at North Branch and compete against other schools. And so the schools are from around the country, not just around Minnesota, but this particular set of lessons does not expect you to join a competition of any sort, especially not ours, but it's a pretty obvious competition if you're at all interested, because it's local and it's easier, frankly, than most other competitions that are in far away places like Huntsville or the desert. So take a look at the competition, think about that, and you could decide maybe by the time this semester is over, hey, that was kind of cool. Let's continue on and build something ourselves and outfit it and customize it and fly it against other schools in the spring.
I don't know though. Last year's competition seemed pretty hard.
Competitions vary. Last year, we tried to get people to land a rocket upright, and that was very hard because these rockets are not really designed to do that, but you can try to work the design. This year's competition is more theoretical, as in, can you make measurements while the rocket is flying and do calculations with them? And so it's more sensors and logging and theory and calculations and not so much mechanisms. Every year we change the rules, and so this year's rules are less mechanistic and more calculational. Maybe that appeals to you, maybe not so much. either way, you need to build a rocket. You need to know how to build a rocket, and that's what we're here to do, is learn how to build rockets and be safe about it. Any questions from anybody about what we're trying to accomplish or what is expected of you?
I am available by email. If you ever have any questions on your build or you just have problems, just email me.
Okay, and I already gave you a heads up that we're going to be looking at your fin can exercise on camera next week. Make sure you have that ready to show. That's your homework, in part, is try that exercise and be ready to show it to us and perhaps talk about it during the lesson next week. Last call for questions.
Not a problem at all, Daniel.
Okay, super. We'll see you in 1 week's time. Bye-bye.